Hey, welcome back to Eatsters. More than 15 years have passed since Dr. David Kelly was found dead in an Oxfordshire wood in one of the darkest episodes of Tony Blair's time as Prime Minister. The official explanation was that the distinguished weapons expert had taken his own life by overdosing on painkillers and cutting his left wrist, after being unmasked as the source of the BBC's claim that the government had sexed up the case for the Iraq War. But since Dr. Kelly's death in 2003, time has done nothing to dispel the cloud of suspicion that hangs over the episode. The troubling questions surrounding it have only increased as the years have passed. Successive governments have refused to allow a full coroner's inquest to be held, fueling the sense of a cover-up. The 59-year-old scientist's body was discovered on July 18, 2003, days after he had been grilled publicly in front of a select committee of MPs about his contact with the BBC journalist Andrew Gilligan. Gilligan had reported that the government dossier, which claimed Iraq could deploy weapons of mass destruction at 45 minutes' notice, was unreliable, exaggerated, or sexed up for political purposes. And Dr. Kelly, a chemical weapons expert who worked for the Foreign Office and Ministry of Defence, was soon unmasked by the Downing Street officials as the BBC's informant. Less than an hour later, Dr. Kelly's body was discovered, and before it had been formally identified or seen by a medical professional who could estimate the cause of death, Blair instructed his Lord Chancellor and an old friend from university, Charles Falconer, to set up a public inquiry into the circumstances surrounding his death. Lord Hutton was handpicked to chair the inquiry, which eventually concluded that Dr. Kelly took his own life and cleared the government of wrongdoing. But the establishment of the Hutton inquiry ensured that the microscopic investigation of the death, which would have happened during a coroner's inquest, never took place. Whereas the coroner would have had formal powers, the Hutton inquiry had none. Witnesses could not be compelled to attend, no evidence was given on oath, and Hutton had total control over who would appear and what documents could be disclosed. The result, in the eyes of many, was a whitewash. In his report, Hutton concluded that Dr. Kelly had taken his life and that nobody could have anticipated this. He stated that the principal cause of death was bleeding from incised wounds to his left wrist, which Dr. Kelly had inflicted on himself with a knife found beside his body. He said that Dr. Kelly had coronary heart disease, that there were copromaximal painkillers in his blood, and that these things might have helped bring about death more certainly and more rapidly. Hutton then added, "I am further satisfied that no other person was involved in the death of Dr. Kelly, and that Dr. Kelly was not suffering from any significant mental illness at the time he took his own life." John Skerr, a world-renowned consultant surgeon specialising in vascular surgery on veins and arteries, does not believe it possible that Dr. Kelly died in the manner officially found. Skerr has stated that Dr. Kelly's half-sister, Sarah Pape, OBE, a leading plastic surgeon based at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Newcastle, rang him shortly after Hutton published his report in January 2004 to say she didn't believe Dr. Kelly had taken his own life. Skerr has his own significant professional doubts too. Remember, he's an expert when it comes to blood vessels. He said, "I don't believe it's possible to die from simply cutting your ulnar artery. It is a very small artery. It's unlikely you could lose enough blood to cause cardiac arrest and death. It is much more likely he died from another cause. One possibly is a heart attack caused by whatever reason, and this was an attempt to mask that. The relevant absence of blood at the scene and the fact that a rather blunt knife was used are significant. If one were to cut the wrist holding the knife in the right hand, the artery that would be cut is not the ulnar artery, which is on the inside of the hand, but the radial artery on the outside of the hand. It seems more probable that someone else took the knife that actually slashed the wrist, taking the stroke across the ulnar artery. Skull's point is that anyone wanting to cut their wrist would first have to come across the radial artery, located under the thumb, rather than the ulnar artery, which lives under the little finger and is buried deep in the wrist. It is hard to find, especially with a knife that is 50 years old and blunt, such as the one found in Kelly's hand. To sever it would require something like a razor blade. Another important witness, David Brochure, the British ambassador to Prague between 1997 and 2001. Brochure was called to give evidence to the Hutton inquiry after telling Foreign Office colleagues of an extraordinary remark Dr. Kelly made to him shortly before he died. Chillingly, Dr. Kelly told him he thought he would be found dead in the woods if Iraq was ever invaded. That was in February 2003, a full 3 months before Dr. Kelly met BBC reporter Andrew Gilligan. Crucially, Brochure said that Dr. Kelly named Blair's spin doctor, Alistair Campbell, as one of these exerting pressure to make the dossier on Iraq's possession of WMDs as strong as possible. Leading establishment figures of the day, from Tony Blair down, agreed to be questioned at the Hutton inquiry. There was evidence from Alistair Campbell and from Sir Richard Dearlove, the then head of MI6. Yet the omissions are glaring. More than 20 key witnesses who might have been expected to give evidence at a coroner's inquest, including the Thames Valley police officer who led the search for Dr. Kelly, were excluded from the inquiry. On the 24 days of which the Hutton inquiry did sit, less than half a day was spent going through the medical evidence related to Dr. Kelly's death. A number of suspicious details were simply ignored, even though they were well known to the police. Take, for example, the fact that there were no fingerprints on the knife Dr. Kelly allegedly used to kill himself, and yet, when his body was found, he wore no gloves. Then there is the startling matter of Dr. Kelly's dental records. On the day he died, but before his body had been officially found, his dentist discovered that his patient records had disappeared. Who took those records? When did they do so? Why did they want them? Among other urgent questions that remain unaddressed are, why incomplete evidence concerning Dr. Kelly's whereabouts during the last week of his life was given to the Hutton inquiry? Why the forensic pathologist who concluded the post-mortem claimed Dr. Kelly was 2 stone lighter than he actually was? And why a police search helicopter with thermal imaging equipment, which had flown 3 hours before over the wood where his body was eventually found, did not detect it, despite the fact that his body's temperature would have been warm enough at the time to register on the helicopter search system? The Hutton inquiry was deeply flawed, raising more questions than answered. What do you think? Was Dr. Kelly murdered? Leave a comment below and any links you know of with further information.